Section 31 of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. It was somewhere in the neighbourhood of 3:30 when the opportunity to interview those three persons was finally vouchsafed him, and it may be recorded at once that the meeting did some violence to his emotions. In short, he found Mr. James Drake, far from being the frank-faced, impulsive, lovable young pepperpot which his actions and words would seem to stand sponsor for, a rather retiring young man of the pale and studious order, absolutely lacking in personal magnetism, and about the last person in the world one would expect to do the all-for-love business of the average hero in the manner he had done. On the other hand, he found the Earl of Fallowfield an exceedingly frank, pleasant-mannered, rather boyish-looking gentleman, whose many attractions rendered it easy to understand why the late Mr. Jefferson P. Drake had conceived such a warm affection for him and was at such pains to have him ever by his side. It seemed, indeed, difficult to believe that he could possibly be the father of Lady Marjorie Wynde, for his manner and appearance was so youthful as to make him appear to be nothing closer than an elder brother. The doctor, that eminent Harley Street light, Mr. John Strangeways Hague, he found to be full of Harley Street manners and Harley Street ideas, eminently polite, eminently cold, and about as pleased to meet a detective police officer as he would be to find an organ grinder sitting on his doorstep. "Have you come to any conclusions as to the means of death, Doctor?" asked Cleek, after he had been shown into the Stone Drum, where the body of the dead man still lay, and where the local coroner and the local J.P. were conducting a sort of preliminary examination prior to the regulation inquest, which must, of course, follow. "The general appearance would suggest asphyxia, if asphyxia were possible."
"Which it is not,"
volunteered Dr. Hague, with the geniality of a snowball.
"You have probably observed that the many slits in the wall permit of free ventilation, and asphyxia with free ventilation is an impossibility."
"Quite so," agreed Cleek placidly. "But if by any chance those slits could have been closed from the outside, I observe that at some period and for some purpose Mr. Drake has made use of a charcoal furnace," indicating it by a wave of the hand, "and apparently with no other vent to carry off the fumes than that supplied by the slits. Now, if they were closed and the charcoal left burning, the result would be an atmosphere charged with carbon monoxide gas, and a little more than 1% of that in the air of a room deprived of ventilation would, in a short time, prove fatal to any person breathing that air." The doctor twitched round an inquiring eye and looked him over from head to foot.
"Yes,"
he said, remembering that, after all, there were board schools, and even the humblest might sometimes learn, parrot-like, to repeat the things that are in books.
"But we happen to know that the slits were not closed, and that neither carbon oxide nor carbon monoxide was the cause of death."
"You have taken samples of the blood, of course, to establish that fact beyond question, as one could so readily do," ventured Cleek suavely. "The test for carbon monoxide is so simple and so very certain that error is impossible. It combines so tensely, if one may put it that way, with the blood, that the colouring of the red corpuscles is utterly overcome and destroyed."
"My good sir, those are elementary facts of which I do not stand in need of a reminder."
"Quite so, quite so. But in my profession, Doctor, one stands in constant need of reminders. A speck, a spot, a pinprick, each and all are significant, and But is this not a slight abrasion on the temple here?" bending over and with his glass examining a minute reddish speck upon the dead man's face. I see, I see. Have you investigated this thing, Doctor? It is interesting."
"I fail to see the point of interest, then,"
replied Dr. Haig, bending over and examining the spot.
"The skin is scarcely more than abraded, evidently by the finger-nail scratching off the head of some infinitesimal pustule."
"Possibly," agreed Cleek. "But on the other hand, it may be something of a totally different character. For one thing, the possible point at which contact was established between the man's blood and something of a poisonous character. An injection of cyanide of potassium, for instance, would cause death, and account in a measure for this suggestion of asphyxia conveyed by the expression of the features."
"True, my good sir. But have the goodness to ask yourself who could get into the place to administer such hypodermic? And if self-administered, what can have become of the syringe? If thrown from one of the bowman's slits, it could only have fallen upon the roof of the wing, and I assure you that was searched most thoroughly long before your arrival. I don't think you will go so far as to suggest that it was shot in, attached to some steel missile capable of making a wound, for no such missile is, as you see, embedded in the flesh, nor was one lying anywhere about the floor. The cyanide of potassium theory is ingenious, but I'm afraid it won't hold water."
Hold water? The phrase brought Cleek's thoughts harking back to what he had been told regarding the little puddle of water lying on the floor, and of a sudden his eyes narrowed and the curious one-sided smile travelled up his cheek. "No, I suppose not," he said, replying to the doctor's remark. "Besides, your test tubes would have settled that when it settled the carbon monoxide question. Had cyanide been present, the specimens of blood would have been clotted and blue." Of a sudden it seemed to dawn upon the doctor that this didn't smack quite so much of board school intelligence as he had fancied, and facing round he looked at Cleek with a new-born interest.
"I beg your pardon," he said, "but I don't think I caught your name, Mr.
"Cleek, Doctor. Hamilton Cleek, at your service."
"Good Lord! That is, my dear sir, my dear Mr. Cleek, if there is any intelligence I can possibly supply, pray command me."
"With pleasure, Doctor. And thank you very much indeed for the kind offer. I have been told that there was a little puddle of water on the floor at the time the murder was discovered. Also that you took a sample of it for analysis. As I don't see any sign of that puddle now, would you mind telling me what that analysis established? I have heard, I may tell you, that you found the water to contain no poisonous substance. But I should be obliged if you can tell me if it was water drawn from a well or such as might have been taken from a river or pond."
"As a matter of fact, my dear Mr. Cleek, I don't think it came from any of the three."
A manufactured mineral water, then?"
"No, not that either. If it had been raining and there was any hole or leak in this roof, I should have said it was rain water that had dripped in and formed a little puddle on the floor. If it had been winter, I should have said it was the result of melted snow. As a matter of fact, I incline more to the latter theory than to any other, although it is absurd, of course, to think of snow being obtainable anywhere in England in the month of July."
"Quite so, quite so. Unless it doesn't matter. That's all, thank you, Doctor, and very many thanks."
"A word, please, Mr. Cleek,"
interposed the Doctor as he turned to move away and leave him.
"I am afraid I was not very communicative, nor very cordial, when you asked me if I had any idea of the means employed to bring about the unfortunate man's death. May I hope that you will be better mannered than I, Mr. Cleek, if I ask you if you have? Thanks very much. Then have you?"
"Yes," said Cleek. "And so, too, will you, if you will make a second blood test with the specimens you have at a period of about 48 hours after the time of decease. It will take quite that before the presence of the thing manifests itself under the influence of any known process, or responds to any known test. And even then it will only be detected by a faintly alcoholic odour and excessively bitter taste. The man has been murdered, done to death, by that devil's drug woorali, if I am not mistaken. But who administered it and how it was administered are things I can't tell you yet."
"Woorali! Woorali! That is the basis of the drug curarin produced by Roulin Bousingot in 1828, from a combination of the allied poisons known to the savages of South America and the tropics by the names of Coroval and Vow, is it not?"
"Yes, and a fiend's thing it is, too. A mere scratch from anything steeped in it is enough to kill an ox almost immediately. The favourite native manner of using the hellish thing is by means of a thorn and a blowpipe, but no such method has been employed in this case. No thorn, nor indeed any other projectile, has entered the flesh, nor is there one lying anywhere about the floor. Be sure I looked, Doctor, the instant I suspected that woorali had been used. Pardon me, but that must be all for the present. I have other fish to fry." End of section 31. Of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. The frying of them took the shape of first going outside and walking round the stone drum, and then of stepping back to the door and beckoning Narkom and Lord Fallowfield and young James Drake out to him. "Anybody in the habit of sitting out here to read or paint or anything of that sort?" he asked abruptly. "Good gracious, no," replied Lord Fallowfield. "Whatever makes you ask such a thing as that, Mr. Cleek?" "Nothing, only that I have found 4 little marks disposed of at such regular distances that they seem to have been made by the 4 legs of a chair resting, with a rather heavy weight upon it, on the leads of the roof and immediately under one of the bowman's slits in the stone drum. A chair with casters, I should imagine, from the character of the marks. We are on a level with the sleeping quarters of the servants in the house proper, I believe, and chairs with casters are not usual in servants' bedrooms in most houses. Are they so here?" "Certainly not," put in young Drake. "Why, I don't believe there is a chair with casters on the whole blessed floor. Is there, Lord Fallowfield? You ought to know."
"Yes, there is, Jim. There are 3, in fact. They are all in the old armoury. Been there a dog's age, and they so matched the old place your poor father never had them taken out."
"The old armoury? What's that, your lordship, may I ask?"
"Oh, a relic of the old feudal times, Mr. Cleek. You see, on account of the position of the stone drum, the weapon room, or arming room, had to be up here on a level with the wing roof instead of below stairs, as in the case of other towers. That's the place over there. The window just to the left of the door leading into the building proper. It is full of the old battle flags, knights' pennants, shields, crossbows, and the Lord knows what of those old days of primitive warfare. We Fallowfields always preserved it just as it was in the days of its usefulness, for its historical interest and its old association with the name. Like to have a look at it?"
"Very much indeed," replied Cleek, and 2 minutes later he was standing in the place and revelling in its air of antiquity. As Lord Fallowfield had declared, the 3 old chairs which supplied seating accommodation were equipped with casters, but although these were the prime reason for Cleek's visit to the place, he gave them little more than a passing glance, bestowing all his attention upon the ancient shields and the quaint old crossbows with which the walls were heavily hung in tier after tier, almost to the groined ceiling. "Primitive times, Mr. Narkom, when men used to go out with these gimcrack things and bang away at each other with skewers," he said, taking one of them down and examining it in a somewhat casual manner, turning it over, testing its weight, looking at its catch, and running his fingers up and down the propelling string. "Fancy a chap with one of these things running up against a modern battery or sailing out into a storm of shrapnel. Back to your hook, grandfather," hanging it up again. "Times change, and we with time. By the way, your lordship, I hope you will be better able to give an account of your whereabouts last night than I hear that Mr. Drake here is able to do regarding his."
"I? Good heavens, man, what do you mean?"
flung out his lordship, so taken aback by the abruptness of the remark that the very breath seemed to be knocked out of him.
"Upon my soul, Mr. Cleek."
"Gently, gently, your lordship. You must certainly realize that in the circumstances the same necessity must exist for you to explain your movements as exists for Mr. Drake. I am told that in the event of the elder Mr. Drake's death, this property was to come to you wholly unencumbered by any charge or any restrictions whatsoever."
"Good God! So it was. Upon my soul, I'd forgotten all about that!"
exclaimed his lordship, with such an air that he was either speaking the absolute truth or was a very good actor indeed.
"Jim, my boy! Oh, good heavens! I never gave the thing a thought. Never one. No, Mr. Cleek, I can give no account of my movements, other than to say I went to bed directly I left the Stone Drum. Or, yes, I can prove that much, by George. I can indeed. Ojeebi was with me, or at least close at my heels at the time, and he saw me go into my room and must have heard me lock the door."
"Ojeebi? Who is he?" "My father's Japanese valet," put in young Drake. "Been with him for the past 5 years. If he tells you that he saw Lord Fallowfield go into his room and lock the door after him, you can rely upon that as an absolute and irrefutable truth. Whitest little yellow man that ever walked on 2 feet, faithful as a dog, and as truthful as they make 'em." "And they don't make 'em any too truthful as a rule in his country, by Jove," said Cleek. "Still, of course, as he could not possibly have anything to gain, call him up, will you, and let us hear what he has to say with regard to Lord Fallowfield's statement." Young Drake rang for a servant, issued the necessary order, and some 5 or 6 minutes later a timid little yellow man with the kindest face and the most gentle step a man could possess came into the room, his soft eyes reddened with much weeping and tear stains marking his sallow cheeks.
"Oh, Mr. Jim! Oh, Mr. Jim! The dear, kind old boss! He gone! He gone!"
he broke out disconsolately as he caught sight of his late master's son and made as if to prostrate himself before him.
"That's all right, Ojeebi. That's all right, old man,"
interrupted young Drake, with a smothered blub in his voice and a twitching movement of his mouth.
"Cut it out. I'm not iron.
Say, this gentleman wants to ask you a few questions, Ojeebi. Deliver the goods just as straight as you know how."
"Me, Mr. Jim? Gentleman want question me?"
the small figure turned, the kindly face lifted, and the sorrowful eyes looked up into Cleek's unemotional ones. "Yes," said he placidly, and forthwith told him what Lord Fallowfield claimed. "That very true," declared Ojeebi. "The lord gentleman he right ahead of me. I see him go into his room and hear him lock door. That very true indeed." Any idea of the time?" "Yes, much idea. 2 minutes past 12. I see clock as I go past Lady Margie's room." "What were you doing knocking about that part of the house at that hour of the night? Your room's up here in the servants' quarters, isn't it?" "Yes, sir. But I go take ice water to the boss's room. Boss never go to bed nights without ice water handy, sir. 'Merican boss never do." "Yes, quite so, quite so. Where did you get the ice from, and how? Chop it from a big cake?" "No, sir. It always froze to fit bottle. I get him from the ice make room downstairs." "He means the refrigerating room, Mr. Cleek," explained young Drake. "You know, I take it, what a necessary commodity we Americans hold ice to be. Indeed, the dear old dad wouldn't think a dinner was a dinner without ice water on the table and ice cream for the final course, and as there was no possibility of procuring a regular and adequate supply in an out-of-the-way spot like this, he had a complete artificial ice-making plant added to the place and overcame the difficulty in that way. That is what Ojeebi means by the ice-make room. What he means about its being frozen to fit the bottles is this: the ice which is to be used for drinking purposes is manufactured in forms or vessels which turn it out in cubes, so that whenever it is wanted all that a servant has to do is to go to the plant and the man in charge supplies him with all the cubes required." "Ah, I see," said Cleek, and stroked his chin. "Well, that's all, I reckon, for the time being. Ojeebi has certainly backed up your statement to the fullest, your lordship, so we can dispense with him entirely. And now, if I have your permission, gentlemen, I should like to feel myself privileged to go poking about the house and grounds for the next hour or so in quest of possible clues. At the end of that time I will rejoin you here and shall hope to have something definite to report. So if you don't mind my going thanks very much. Come along, Mr. Narkom. I've a little something for you to do, and an hour will do it or I'm a Dogberry." With that he took his departure from the armoury, and with the superintendent following, went down through the house to the grounds and out into the screen of close-crowding, view-defying trees. Here he paused a minute to pull out his notebook and scribble something on a leaf, and then to tear out that leaf and put it into Mr. Narkom's hand. "Rush Lennard off to the post office with that, will you, and have it wired up to town as soon as possible," he said. "Prepay the reply and get that reply back to me as soon as telegraph and motor can get it here." Then he swung off out of the screen of the trees and round the angle of the building and set about hunting for the refrigerating plant. End of Section 32. Section 33 of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. It was 5 and after when the superintendent, pale and shaking with excitement, came up the long drive from the hall gates and found Cleek lounging in the doorway of the house, placidly smoking a cigarette and twirling a little ball of crumpled newspaper in his hand. "Right, was I, Mr. Narkom?" he queried smilingly.
Good God, yes. Right as rain, old chap. Been carrying it for upward of a 12-month, and no doubt waiting for an opportunity to strike."
"Good. And while you have been attending to your little part of the business, I've been looking out for mine, dear friend. Look," said Cleek, and opened up the little ball of paper sufficiently to show what looked like a cut glass scent bottle belonging to a lady's dressing bag, close stoppered with a metal plug sealed round with candle wax. Woorali, my friend, and enough in it to kill an army. Come along. We've got to the bottom of the thing. Let us go up and report. The gentlemen will be getting anxious." They were, for on reaching the armoury they found young Drake and Lord Fallowfield showing strong traces of the mental strain under which they were labouring, and talking agitatedly with Lady Marjorie Wynde, who had in the interim come up and joined them, and was herself apparently in need of something to sustain and to strengthen her, for Ojeebi was standing by with an extended salver from which she had just lifted to her lips a glass of port.
"Good God! I never was so glad to see anybody in my life, gentlemen,"
broke out young Drake as they appeared.
"It's beyond the hour you asked for, ages beyond, and my nerves are almost pricking their way through my skin. Mr. Cleek, Mr. Narkom, speak up, for heaven's sake. Have you succeeded in finding out anything?"
"We've done better than that, Mr. Drake," replied Cleek, "for we have succeeded in finding out everything. Look sharp there, Mr. Narkom, and shut that door. Lady Marjorie looks as if she were going to faint, and we don't want a whole houseful of servants piling in here. That's it. Back against the door, please. Her ladyship seems on the point of crumpling up."
"No, no, I'm not. Indeed, I'm not,"
protested Lady Marjorie with a forced smile and a feeble effort to hold her galloping nerves in check.
"I am excited and very much upset, of course, but I am really much stronger than you would think. Still, if you would rather I should leave the room, Mr. Cleek—"
"Oh, by no means, your ladyship. I know how anxious you are to learn the result of my investigations, and by that token somebody else is anxious too, the doctor. Call him in, will you, Mr. Drake? He is still with the others in the stone drum, I assume." He was, and he came out of it with them at young Drake's call and joined the party in the armoury. "Doctor," said Cleek, looking up as he came in, "we've got to the puzzles on picking, and I thought you'd be interested to hear the result. I was right about the substance employed, for I've found the stuff and I've nailed the guilty party. It was woorali, and the reason why there was no trace of a weapon was because the blessed thing melted. It was an icicle, my friend, an icicle with its point steeped in woorali, and if you want to know how it did its work, why, it was shot in there from the crossbow hanging on the wall immediately behind me. And the person who shot it in was so short that a chair was necessary to get up to the bowman's slit when— No, you don't, my beauty. There's a gentleman with a noose waiting to pay his respects to all such beasts as you." Speaking, he sprang with a sharp, flashing movement that was like to nothing so much as the leap of a pouncing cat, and immediately there was a yap and a screech, a yell and a struggle, a click of clamping handcuffs and a scuffle of writhing limbs, and a moment later they that were watching saw him rise with a laugh and stand with his hands on his hips looking down at Ojeebi lying crumpled up in a heap, with gyves on his wrists and panic in his eyes, at the foot of the guarded door. "Well, my pleasant-faced, agreeable little demon, it'll be many a long day before the spirits of your ancestors welcome you back to Nippon," Cleek said as the panic-stricken Jap, realizing what was before him, began to shriek and shriek until his brain and nerves sank into a collapse and he fainted where he lay. "I've got you and I've got the woorali. I went through your trunk and found it, as I knew I should from the moment I clapped eyes upon you. If the laws of the country are so lax that they make it possible for you to do what you have done, they also are stringent enough to make you pay the price of it with your yellow little neck." "In the name of Heaven, Mr. Cleek," spoke up young Drake, breaking silence suddenly, "what can the boy have done? You speak as if it were he that murdered my father. But, man, why should he? What had he to gain? What motive could a harmless little chap like this have for killing the man he served?" "The strongest in the world, my friend. The greed of gain," said Cleek. "What he could not do in your father's land it is possible for him to do in this one,
which foolishly allows its subjects to ensure even the life of its ruler without his will, knowledge, or consent. For nearly a 12-month this little brute has been carrying a heavy insurance upon the life of Jefferson P. Drake, but thank God he'll never live to collect it. What's that, Doctor? How did I find that out? By the simplest means possible, my dear sir. For a reason which concerns nobody but myself, I dropped in at the Guildford office of the Royal British Life Assurance Society in the latter part of last May, and upon that occasion I marked the singular circumstance that a Japanese was then paying the premium of an already existing policy. Why I speak of it as a singular circumstance, and why I let myself be impressed by it, lie in the fact that as the Japanese regard their dead ancestors with absolute veneration, and the privilege of being united with them a boon which makes death glorious, life assurance is not popular with them, since it seems to be insulting their ancestors and makes joining them tainted with the odour of baser things. Consequently, I felt pretty certain that it was some other life than his own he was there to pay the regularly recurring premium upon. The chances are, Doctor, that in the ordinary run of things I should never have thought of that man or that circumstance again, but it so happens that I have a very good memory for faces and events. So when I came down here to investigate this case, and in the late Mr. Drake's valet saw that Japanese man again, voila, I should have been an idiot not to put two and two together. The remainder, a telegram inquiring if an insurance upon the life of Jefferson P. Drake, the famous inventor, had been effected by anybody but the man himself, settled the thing beyond question. As for the rest, it is easy enough to explain. Your remark that the little puddle found upon the floor of the stone drum appeared to you to bear a distinct resemblance to the water resulting from melted snow, added to what I already knew regarding the refrigerating plant installed here, put me on the track of the ice. And as the small spot on the temple was of so minute a character, I knew that the weapon must have been pointed. A pointed weapon of ice leaves but one conclusion possible, Doctor. I have since learned from the man in charge of the refrigerating plant that this yellow blob of iniquity here was much taken by the icicles which the process of refrigeration caused to accumulate in the place and upon the machine itself during rotation, and that last night, shortly after 12 o'clock, he came down and broke off and carried away 3 of them. How I came to know what motive power he employed to launch the poisoned shaft can be explained in a word. Most of the weapons, indeed all but one, hanging on the wall of this armoury are lightly coated with dust, showing that it must be a week or more since any housemaid's work was attended to in this particular quarter. One of them is not dusty. Furthermore, when I took it down for the purpose of examining it, I discovered that, although smeared with ink or paint to make it look as old as the others, the bowstring was of fresh catgut, and there was a suspicious dampness about the catch which suggested either wet hands or the partial melting under the heat of living flesh of the shaft which had been an icicle. That's all, Doctor. That's all, Mr. Drake. That's quite all, Lord Fallowfield. A good, true-hearted young chap will get both the girl he wants and the inheritance which should be his by right. A good, true friend will get back the ancestral home he lost through misfortune and has regained through chance. And a patient and faithful lady will in all probability get the man she loves without now having to wait until he comes into a dead man's shoes. Lady Marjorie, my compliments. Doctor, my best respects. And gentlemen all, good afternoon.
And here, with that weakness for the theatrical which was his besetting sin, he bowed to them with his hat laid over his heart and walked out of the room. End of section 33. Section 34 of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. No, Mr. Narkom, no. As an instrument of death, the icicle is not new, said Cleek, answering the superintendent's question as the limousine swung out through the gates of Hetherington Hall and faced the long journey back to London. If you will look up the records of that energetic female Catherine de Medici, Queen of France, you will find that she employed it in that capacity upon 2 separate occasions, and coming down to more modern times, you will also find that in the year 1872 the Russian Lydia Borlovska used it at Galich in the province of Kostroma to stab her sleeping husband. But as a projectile it is new. As a successful projectile, I mean. For there have been many attempts made, owing to its propensity to dissolve after use, to discharge it from firearms, but never in one single instance have those attempts resulted in success. The explosion has always resulted in shivering and dispersing it in a shower of splinters as it leaves the muzzle of the weapon. There can be no doubt, however, that could it be propelled in a perfectly horizontal position, the power behind it would, in spite of its brittle nature, drive it through a pine board an inch thick. But, as I have said, the motive power always defeats the object by landing it against the target in a mass of splinters.
I see. And the Jap got over that by employing a crossbow, and that, of course, did the trick.
No. I doubt if he would have been able to put enough power behind that to drive it into the man's body with deadly effect, if indeed he could make it enter it at all. Where Ojeebi scored over all others lay in the fact that with his plan there was no necessity to have the icicle enter the victim's body at all. He required nothing more than just sufficient power of propulsion to break the skin and establish contact with the blood. And then that hellish compound on the point of the projectile could be depended upon to do the rest. It did, as you know, and then dropped to the floor and melted away, leaving nothing but a little puddle of water behind it.
But, Cleek, my dear chap, how do you account for the fact that when the doctor came to analyze that water, he found no trace of the poison in it?
He did, Mr. Narkom, only that he didn't recognize it. Woorali is extremely volatile, for one thing, and evaporates rapidly. For another, there was a very small quantity used, a very small quantity necessary, so malignant it is, and the water furnished by the melting icicle could dilute that little tremendously. It would not be able to obliterate all trace of it, however, but the infinitesimal portion remaining would make spring water give the same answer in analysis as that given by the water resulting from melted snow. It was when Dr. Haig mentioned the fact that if it wasn't for the utter absurdity of looking for such a substance in England in July, he should have said it was melted snow, that I really got my first clue. Later, however, when... But come, let's chuck it. I've had enough of murder and murderers for one day. Let's talk of something else. Our new turnout here, for instance. You have done yourself proud this time, and no mistake. She certainly is a beauty, Mr. Narkom. By the way, what have you done with the old red one? Sold it?
Not I, indeed. I know a trick worth 2 of that. I send it out empty every day in the hope of having those Apache Johnnies follow it, and have a plainclothes man trailing along behind in a taxi ready to nip in and follow them if they do.
But they don't. That is, they haven't up to the present. But there's always hope, you know."
"Not in that direction, I'm afraid. Waldemar's a better general than that, believe me. Knowing that we have discovered his little plan of following the red limousine, just as we discovered his other of following me, he will have gone off on another tack, believe me."
"Scotland! You don't think, do you, that he can possibly have found out anything about the new one and has set in to follow this?"
"No, I do not. As a matter of fact, I fancy he has started to do what he ought to have done in the beginning. That is, to keep a close watch on the criminal news in the papers day by day, and every time a crime of any importance crops up, pay his respects to the theatre of it and find out who is the detective handling the case. A ducat to a doughnut he'd have been on our heels down here to day if this little business of the stone drum had been made public in time to get into the morning papers. He means to have me, Mr. Narkom, if having me is possible. And he's down to the last ditch and getting desperate. Yesterday's cables from Mauravania are anything but reassuring."
"I know. They say that unless something happens very shortly to turn the tide in Ulric's favour and quell the cries for restoration, the king's downfall and expulsion are merely a matter of a few days at most. But what's that got to do with it, that you suggest its bearing upon any need for haste on Waldemar's part?"
"Only that with matters in such a state, he cannot long defer his return to the army of his country and the defence of its king," replied Cleek serenely. "And every day he loses in failing to pay his respects to your humble servant in the manner he desires to do increases the strain of the situation and keeps him from the service of his royal master."
"Well, I wish to God something would happen to blow him and his royal master and their blooming royal country off the map, damn 'em!"
blazed out Narkom, too savage to be choice of words.
"We've never had a moment's peace, you and I, since the dashed combination came into the game. And for what, I should like to know? Not that it's any use asking you. You're so devilish close-mouthed a man might as well ask questions of a ton of coal for all answer he may hope to get. I shall always believe, however, that you did something pretty dashed bad to the King of Mauravania that time you were over there on that business about the Rainbow Pearl to make the beggar turn against you, as I believe he has."
"Then you will always believe what isn't true," replied Cleek, lighting a fresh cigarette. "I simply restored the pearl and his Majesty's letter to the hands of Count Irma, and did not so much as see the king while I was there. Why should I? A mere police detective who had been hired to do a service and paid for it like any other hireling. I took my money and I went my way. That's all there was about it. If it has pleased Count Waldemar to entertain an ugly feeling of resentment toward me, I can't help that, can I now?"
"Oh, then it's really a personal affair between you and him, after all?"
"Something like that. He doesn't approve of my knowing things that I do know, and it would be the end of a very promising future for him if I told. Here, have a cigarette and smoke yourself into a better temper. You look savage enough to bite a nail in two."
"I'd bite it in four if it looked anything like that Waldemar Johnny, by James,"
asserted the superintendent vigorously.
"And if he ever lays a hand on you Look here, Cleek, I know it sounds un-English, very continental, rotten soft from one man to another, but damn it, Cleek, I love you. I'd go to hell for you. I'd die fighting for you. Do you understand?"
"Perfectly," said Cleek. Then he put out his hand and took Mr. Narkom's in a hard, firm grip, and added gently, "My friend, my comrade, my pal. Side by side together to the end." and the car ran on for a good half-mile before either spoke again. End of section 34. Section 35 of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. Mr. Narkom. It was an hour later, and Cleek's voice broke the silence abruptly. He had taken out his notebook and had been scribbling in it for some little time, but now, as he spoke, he tore out the written leaf and passed it over to the superintendent. "Mr. Narkom, I refused in the beginning to give you the address of the little house at which I was located. Here it is. Put it in your pocket-book against future need, will you?"
"Yes, certainly. But, Cinnamon, old chap, what good is it to me now when you've left the place?"
"You will understand, perhaps, when I tell you that Miss Lorne is its present occupant. It was for that I took it in the beginning. There may come a need to communicate with her. There may come a need for her to communicate with you. There's always a chance, you know, that a candle may be put out when the wind blows at it from all directions. And if anything should happen I mean, if anything having a bearing upon me personally that you think she ought to be told should come to pass, well, just go to her at once, will you? There's a dear friend. That's the address, don't lose it, and full directions how to get there speedily. I am giving it to you now, as we shall soon be in town again, and I shall leave you directly we arrive there. I'm in haste to get back to Dollops and see if between us we can't hit upon some plan, he and I, to get at the whereabouts of Waldemar. That plain clothes man of yours is like the butler with the bottle of cider. He doesn't seem to get any forrarder."
"Kibblewhite!"
blurted out the superintendent, sitting up sharply.
"Well, of all the born jackasses, all the muttonheads in this world."
"Well, he doesn't seem to be very bright, I must say."
"Eh? Lard, I wasn't talking about him. I was talking about myself. I had something to tell you to day, and this blessed business drove it clean out of my head. Kibblewhite had the dickens and all of a time trying to get at that chap Serpice, as you may remember."
"I do, in a measure. Succeeded in finding out finally that the carriage he drove was one he hired from a liveryman by the month, I think was the last report you gave me, but couldn't get any further with the business because Serpice took it into his head not to call for the carriage again, and made off, this Kibblewhite chap didn't know where, and appears never to have found a means of discovering."
"No, he didn't. But 10 days ago he got word from the liveryman that Serpice had just turned up and was about to make use of the carriage again, and off Kibblewhite cut hot foot in the hope of being able to follow him. No go, however. By the time he arrived at the stable, Serpice had already gone, so there was nothing left for the poor disappointed chap to do but to go out on the hunt and see if he couldn't pick him up somewhere in the streets."
"Which he didn't, of course."
"Excuse me, which he did. But it was late in the afternoon, and he was coming back to the stable with the carriage empty. Also, it was in the thick of the traffic at Ludgate Circus, and Kibblewhite was so afraid the fellow might mix himself up in it and give him the slip that he took a chance shot to prevent it. Nipping up the officer on point, he made himself and his business known, and in a winking in nips the constable, hauls Mr. Serpice up sharp, and arrests him for driving a public vehicle without a licence."
"Well played, Kibblewhite," approved Cleek. "That, of course, meant that the fellow would be arrested and have to give his address and all the rest of it."
"So Kibblewhite himself thought. But what does the beggar do but turn the tables on him in the most unexpected manner by absolutely refusing to do anything of the kind. and as he did not have a licence and would not call anybody to pay his fine, the magistrate finished the business by committing him to jail for 10 days in default. And here's the thing I was ass enough to forget. His 10 days' imprisonment was up this morning. Kibblewhite, in disguise, was to be outside the jail to follow him when he was discharged and see where he went. And he told me to look for him to turn up at the Yard before 6 this evening with a full report of the result of his operations."
"Bravo!" said Cleek, leaning back in his seat with a sigh of satisfaction. "I've changed my mind about leaving you, Mr. Narkom. We will go on to the Yard together. As in all probability, after 10 days without being able to communicate with his pals or with Waldemar, our friend Serpice will be hot to get to them at once and explain the cause of his long absence. The chances are that Kibblewhite will have something of importance to report at last." He had, as they found out when, in the fullness of time, they arrived at the Yard and were told that he was waiting for them in the superintendent's office, and in his excitement he almost threw it at them, so eager he was to report.
"I've turned the trick at last, Superintendent," he cried. "The silly josser played straight into my hands, sir. The minute he was out of jail he made a bee-line for Soho, and me after him, and there he takes to earth in a rotten little restaurant in the worst part of the district. And when I nips over and has a look inside, there he was shaking hands with a lot of Frenchies of his own kind, and them all prancing about and laughing like they'd gone off their bloomin' heads. I sees there aren't no back door to the place, and I knows from that he'd have to come out the same way as he went in. So off I nips over to the other side of the street and lays in wait for him. After about 10 minutes or so, out he comes, him and another of the lot, mopping of his mouth with his coat sleeve, and off they starts in a great hurry, and me after them. They first goes to a barber shop where the man I was following nips in, has a shave, a haircut, and a wash-up, while the chap that was with him toddles off and fetches him a clean shirt and a suit of black clothes. In about 15 minutes out my man comes again, making a tolerable respectable appearance, sir, after his barbering, and in his clean linen and decent clothes. Him and his mate stands talking and grinning for a minute or so. Then they shakes hands and separates, and off my man cuts it westward. Sir, I sticks to him like a brother. I follows him smack across to the Strand and along that to the Hotel Cecil. And there the beggar nips in and goes up the courtyard as bold as you please. Sends up his name to a gent. The gent sends down word for him to be showed up at once. And in that way I spots my man. For when I goes up to the clerk and shows my badge and asks who was the party my Johnny had asked for, he tells me straight and clear, gentleman he's making a suit of clothes for. Baron Rodolphe de Montravenne, an Austrian nobleman who has been stopping here for weeks."
Cleek twitched round his eye and glanced at Narkom. "'Things least hidden are best hidden,'" he quoted, smiling. "The dear Count knows a thing or two, you perceive. You have done very well indeed, Kibblewhite. Here is your £10 note, and many thanks for your services. Good evening." Kibblewhite took the money and his departure immediately, but so long as he remained within hearing distance, so long as the echo of his departing steps continued to sound, Cleek remained silent, and the curious crooked smile made a loop in his cheek. But of a sudden, "Mr. Narkom," he said quietly, "I shan't be found in any of my usual haunts for the next few days. If, however, you should urgently need me, call at the Hotel Cecil and ask for Captain Maltravers. And call in disguise, please. Our friend the Count is keen. Remember the name, or better still, write it down."
"But, good God, Cleek, such a risk as that!"
"No, please, don't attempt to dissuade me. I want that man, and I'll get him if getting him be humanly possible. That's all. Thanks very much. Good-bye." Then the door opened and shut, and by the time Mr. Narkom could turn round from writing down the name he had been given, he was quite alone in the room. End of section 35. Six of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33.
Number 992. Captain Maltravers, please. 992. Number 992.
Thrice the voice of the page, moving and droning out his words in that perfunctory manner peculiar unto the breed of hotel pages the world over, sounded its dreary monotone through the hum of conversation in the rather crowded tea-room without producing the slightest effect. Then, of a sudden, the gentleman seated in the far corner reading the daily paper, a tall, fair-haired, fair-moustached gentleman with "The Army" written all over him in capital letters, twitched up his head, listened until the call was given for the fourth time, and thereupon snapped his fingers sharply, elevated a beckoning digit, and called out crisply, "Here, my boy! Over here! This way!" The boy went to him immediately, extended a small circular metal salver, and then, lifting the thumb which held in position the handwritten card thereon, allowed the slip of pasteboard to be removed. "Gentlemen, sir, waiting in the office," he volunteered. Captain Maltravers glanced at the card, frowned, rose with it still held between his fingers, and within the space of a minute's time walked into the hotel's public office and the presence of a short, stout, full-bearded dumpling of a man with the florid complexion and the country-cut clothes of a gentleman farmer, who half sat and half leaned upon the arm of a leather-covered settle, nervously tapping with the ferrule of a thick walking-cane a boot whose exceedingly high sole and general construction mutely stood sponsor for a withered and shortened leg.
"My dear Yard, I am delighted to see you,"
exclaimed the captain as he bore down on the little round man and shook hands with him heartily.
"Grimshaw told me that you'd be coming up to London shortly, but I didn't allow myself to hope that it would be so soon as this. Gad, it's a dog's age since I've seen you. Come along up to my own room and let us have a good old-fashioned chat. Key of 992, please, clerk. Thanks very much. Come along, Yard. This way, old chap."
With that he linked his arm in his caller's, bore him, clumping and wobbling, to the nearby lift, and thence in due course to the door of number 992 and the seclusion which lay behind it. He was still chattering away gaily as the lift dropped down out of sight and left them, upon which he shut the door, locked it upon the inside, and stopping long enough to catch up a towel and hang it over the keyhole, turned on his heel and groaned.
"What? Am I not to have even a 2 days' respite, you indefatigable machine?"
he said as he walked across the room and threw himself into a chair with a sigh of annoyance.
"Think! It was only this morning that I ventured upon the first casual bow of a fellow guest with the dear Baron. Only at luncheon we exchanged the first civil word. But the ice was broken, and I should have had him roped in by tea-time, I'm sure of it. And now you come and nip my hopes in the bud like this, and in a disguise that a fellow as sharp as he would see through in a wink if he met you." "It was the best I could do, Cleek. I'm not a dabster in the art of making up, as you know."
Mr. Narkom's voice was, like his air, duly apologetic.
"Besides, I hung around until I saw him go out before I ventured in, although I was on thorns the whole blessed time. I had to see you, old chap. I simply had to, and every minute was of importance. I shouldn't have ventured to come at all if it hadn't been imperative."
"I'm sure of that," said Cleek, recovering his good humour instantly.
"Don't mind my beastly bad temper this afternoon, there's a good friend.
It's a bit of a disappointment, of course, after I'd looked forward to a clear field just as soon as Waldemar should return, but it is you first and foremost, at all times and under all circumstances. Other matters count as nothing with me when you call. Always remember that."
"I do, old chap. It's because I do that I went to the length of promising Miss Larue that I'd lay the case before you."
"Miss Larue? A moment, please. Will the lady to whom you refer be Miss Margaret Larue, the celebrated actress? The one in question who treated me so cavalierly last August in that business regarding the disappearance of that chap James Colliver?"
"Yes, he was her brother, you recollect, and don't get hot about it, Cleek. I know she treated you very badly in that case, and so does she, but—"
"She treated me abominably," interposed Cleek with some heat. "First setting me on the business and then calling me off just as I'd got a grip on the thing and was within measuring distance of the end. I can't forgive that, and I never could fathom her reason for it. If it was, as you yourself suggested at the time, because she shrank from the notoriety that was likely to accrue to her from letting everybody in the world know that Jimmy the Shifter was her own brother, she ought to have thought of that in the beginning when she acknowledged it so openly, instead of making such an ass of me by her high-handed proceeding of calling me off the scent at its hottest, as if I were a tame puppy to be pulled this way and that with a string. I object to being made a fool of, Mr. Narkom, and there's no denying the fact that Miss Larue treated me very badly in that James Colliver case. Very badly and very cavalierly indeed." Unquestionably Miss Larue had. Even Mr. Narkom had to admit that. For the facts which lay behind these heated remarks were not such as are calculated to make any criminal investigator pleased with his connection therewith. Clearly set forth, those facts were as follows. On the 19th day of the preceding August, James Colliver had disappeared as suddenly and as completely and with as little trace left behind as does a kinematograph picture when it vanishes from the screen. Now, the world at large had never heard of James Colliver until he did disappear, and it is extremely doubtful if it would have done so even then, but that circumstances connected with his vanishment brought to light the startling disclosure that the worthless, dissolute hulk of a man who was known to the habitués of half the low-class public houses in Hoxton by the pseudonym of Jimmy the Shifter was not only all that time and drink had left of the once popular melodramatic actor Julian Monteith, but that he was, in addition thereto, own brother to Miss Margaret Larue, the distinguished actress who was at that moment electrifying London by her marvellous performance of the leading role in the late Mrs. Cavendish. The reasons which impelled Miss Larue to let the public discover that her real name was Maggie Colliver, and that Jimmy the Shifter was related to her by such close ties of blood, were these. The late Mrs. Cavendish was nearing the close of its long and successful run at the Royalty, and its successor was already in rehearsal for early production. That successor was to be a specially rewritten version of the old-time favourite play, Catherine Howard, or The Tomb, the Throne, and the Scaffold, with Miss Larue, of course, in the part of the ambitious and ill-fated Catherine. Preparations were on foot for a production which would be splendidly elaborate as to scenery and effects, and absolutely accurate as to detail. For instance, the costume which Henry VIII had worn at the time of his marriage with Catherine Howard was copied exactly, down to the minute question of the gaudy stitchery on the backs of the gloves and the toes of the shoes, and permission had been obtained to make the mimic betrothal ring which the stage Henry was to press upon the finger of the stage Catherine an exact replica of the real one, as preserved among the nation's historic jewels. Not to be outdone in this matter of accuracy,
Miss Larue naturally aimed to have the dresses and the trinkets she wore as nearly like those of the original Catherine as it was possible to obtain. As her position in the world of art was now so eminent, and had brought her into close touch with the elect, it was not difficult for the lady to borrow dresses and even jewels of the exact period from the heirlooms treasured by members of the nobility, that these might be copied in mimic gems for her by the well-known Theatrical and Show Supply Company of Henry Trent and Son, Soho. To this firm, which was in full charge of the preparation of dresses, properties, and accessories for the great production, was also entrusted the making of a cast of Miss Larue's features, and the manufacture therefrom of a wax head, with which it was at first proposed to lend a touch of startling realism to the final scene of the execution of Catherine on Tower Hill, but which was subsequently abandoned after the first night as being unnecessarily gruesome and repulsive. It was during the course of the final rehearsals for this astonishing production, and when the army of supers who had long been drilling for it at other hours was brought for the first time into contact with the principals, that Miss Larue was horrified to discover among the members of that army her dissolute brother, Jimmy the Shifter. For years, out of sheer sympathy for the wife who clung to him to the last, and the young son who was growing up to be a fine fellow, despite the evil stock from which he had sprung, Miss Larue had continuously supplied this worthless brother with money enough to keep him, with the strict proviso that he was never to come near any theatre where she might be performing, nor ever at any time to make known his relationship to her. She now saw in this breaking of a rule which heretofore he had inviolably adhered to, clear evidence that the man had suddenly become a menace, and she was in great haste to get him out of touch with her colleagues before anything could be done to disgrace her. In so sudden and so pressing an emergency, she could think of no excuse but an errand by which to get him out of the theatre, and of no errand but one, the stage jewels which Messrs. Trent and Son were making for her. She therefore sat down quickly at the prompt table, and, drawing a sheet of paper to her, wrote hurriedly, "Messrs. Trent and Son, gentlemen, please give the bearer my jewels, or such of them as are finished, if you have not done with all, that he may bring them to me immediately, as I have instant need of them. Yours faithfully, Margaret Larue." This she passed over to the stage manager with a request to "Please read that, Mr. Lampson, and certify over your signature that it is authentic, and that you vouch for having seen me write it." After which she got up suddenly and said as calmly as she could, "Mr. Supermaster, I want to borrow one of your men to go on an important errand to Trent and Son for me. This one will do," signalling out her brother. "Spare him, please. This way, my man. Come quickly." With that, she suddenly caught up the note she had written, and which the stage manager had, as requested, certified, and, beckoning her brother to follow, walked hurriedly off the stage to a deserted point in the wings. "Why have you done this dreadful thing?" she demanded in a low, fierce tone as soon as he came up with her. "Are you a fool as well as a knave that you come here and risk losing your only support by a thing like this?"
"I wanted to see you. I had to see you, and it was the only way,"
he gave back in the same guarded tone.
"The wife is dead. She died last night, and I've got to get money somewhere to bury her. I'd no one to send, since you've taken Ted away and sent him to school, so I had to come myself."
The knowledge that it was for no more desperate reason than this that he had forced himself into her presence came as a great relief to Miss Larue. She hastened to get rid of him by sending him to Trent and Son with the note that she had written, and to tell him to carry the parcel that would be handed to him to the rooms she was occupying in Portman Square, and which she made up her mind to vacate the very next day, and there to wait until she came home from rehearsal. He took the note and left the theatre at once, upon which Miss Larue, considerably relieved, returned to the duties in hand, and promptly banished all thought of him from her mind. It was not until something like 2 hours afterward that he was brought back to mind in a somewhat disquieting manner. "I say, Miss Larue," said the stage manager, as she came off after thrice rehearsing a particularly trying scene, and with a weary sigh dropped into a vacant chair at his table, "aren't you worried about that chap you sent with the note to Trent & Son? There's been time for him to go and return twice over, you know, and I observe that he's not back yet. Aren't you a bit uneasy?"
"No. Why should I be?"
"Well, for one thing, I should say it was an extremely risky business unless you knew something about the man. Suppose, for instance, he should make off with the jewels. A pretty pickle you'd be in with the parties from whom you borrowed them, by Jove."
"Good gracious, you don't suppose I sent him for the originals, do you?" said Miss Larue with a smile. "Trent & Son would think me a lunatic to do such a thing as that. What I sent him for was, of course, merely the paste replicas. The originals I shall naturally go for myself."
"God bless my soul! The paste replicas, do you say?" blurted in Mr. Lampson excitedly. "Why, I thought Trent & Son will be sure to think so themselves under the circumstances. They can't possibly think otherwise."
"Under the circumstances? Think otherwise?" repeated Miss Larue, facing round upon him sharply. "What do you mean by that, Mr. Lampson? Good heavens, not that they could possibly be mad enough to give the man the originals?"
"Yes, certainly. Good Lord! What else can they think? What else can they give him? They sent the paste duplicates here by their own messenger this morning. They are in the manager's office, in his safe, at this very minute, and I was going to bring them round to you as soon as the rehearsal is over." Consternation followed this announcement, of course. The rehearsal was called to an abrupt halt. Mr. Lampson and Miss Larue flew round to the front of the house in a sort of panic, got to the telephone and rang up Trent & Son, who confirmed their worst fears. Yes, the man had arrived with the note from Miss Larue something over an hour ago, and they had promptly handed him over the original jewels. Not all of them, of course, but those which they had finished duplicating and of which they had sent the replicas to the theatre by their own messenger that morning. Surely that was what Miss Larue meant by the demand, was it not? No other explanation seemed possible after they had sent her the copies and good Lord! Hadn't heard about it? Meant the imitations? Heavens above, what an appalling mistake! What was that? The man? Oh, yes, he took the things after Mr. Trent Senior had removed them from the safe and handed them over to him, and he had left Mr. Trent's office directly he received them. Miss Larue could ascertain exactly what had been delivered to him by examining the duplicates their messenger had carried to the theatre. Miss Larue did, discovering to her dismay that they represented a curious ruby necklace of which the original had been lent her by the Duchess of Oldhampton, a stomacher of sapphires and pearls borrowed from the Marquise of Chepstow, and a rare Tudor clasp of diamonds and opals which had been lent to her by the Lady Marjorie Thrale. In a panic she rushed from the theatre, called a taxi, and, hoping against hope, whirled off to her rooms at Portman Square. No Mr. James Colliver had been there. Nor did he come there ever. Neither did he return to the squalid home where his dead wife lay. Nor did any of his cronies nor any of his old haunts see hide or hair of him from that time. Furthermore, nobody answering to his description had been seen to board any train, steamship, or sailing vessel leaving for foreign parts. Nor could there be found any hotel, lodging-house, furnished or even unfurnished apartment into which he had entered that day or upon any day thereafter. In despair, Miss Larue drove to Scotland Yard and put the matter into the hands of the police, offering a reward of £1,000 for the recovery of the jewels, and through the medium of the newspapers promised Mr. James Colliver that she would not prosecute, but would pay that £1,000 over to him if he would return the gems, that she might restore them to their rightful owners. Mr. James Colliver neither accepted that offer nor gave any sign that he was aware of it. It was then that Scotland Yard, in the person of Cleek, stepped in to conduct the search for both man and jewels, and within 48 hours some amazing circumstances were brought to light. First and foremost, Mr. Henry Trent, who said he had given the gems over to Colliver and that the man had immediately left the office, was unable, through the fact of his son's absence from town, to give any further proof of that statement than his own bare word, for there was nobody but himself in the office at the time, whereas the door porter, who distinctly remembered James Colliver's entrance into the building, as distinctly remembered that up to the moment when evening brought knocking off time, James Colliver had never, to his certain knowledge, come out of it. The next amazing fact to be unearthed was that one of the office cleaners had found, tucked under the stairs leading up to the top floor, a sponge which had beyond all possible question been used to wipe blood from something, and had evidently been tucked there in a great hurry. The third amazing discovery took the astonishing shape of finding in an East End pawnbroker's shop every one of the missing articles, and positive proof that the man who had pledged them was certainly not in the smallest degree like James Colliver, but was evidently a person of a higher walk in life and more prosperous in appearance than the missing man had been since the days when he was a successful actor. These circumstances Cleek had just brought to light when Miss Larue, having found the gems, determined to drop the case, and refused thereafter so much as to discuss it with any living soul. That her reason for taking this unusual step had something behind it which was of more moment than the mere fact that the jewels had been recovered and returned to their respective owners, there could hardly be a doubt, for from that time onward her whole nature seemed to undergo a radical change, and from being a brilliant, vivacious, cheery-hearted woman, whose spirits were always of the highest and whose laughter was frequent, she developed suddenly into a silent, smileless, mournful one, who shrank from all society but that of her lost brother's orphaned son, and who seemed to be oppressed by the weight of some unconfessed cross and the shadow of some secret woe. Such were the facts regarding the singular Colliver case at the time when Cleek laid it down, unprobed, unsolved, as deep a mystery in the end as it had been in the beginning. And such they still were, when on this day, at this critical time, and after an interval of 11 months, Mr. Maverick Narkom came to ask him to pick it up again.
And with an element of fresh mystery added to complicate it more than ever, dear chap,
he declared rather excitedly.
For as the father vanished 11 months ago, so yesterday the son too disappeared, in the same manner, from the same point, in the self-same building, and in the same inexplicable and almost supernatural way. Only that in this instance the mystery is even more incomprehensible, more like magic than ever, for the boy is known to have been shown by a porter into a room almost entirely surrounded by glass, a room whose interior was clearly visible to 2 persons who were looking into it at the time, and then and there to have completely vanished, without anybody knowing when, where, or how.
End of section 36.